Welcome everyone to our second and final Tax Matters hours for this fall semester. My name is Nicole Wesley. I'm the Senior Program Manager of Career Supports, and I'm happy to have our guest, Professor Francine Lipman. We're excited to have you again. I'll have Professor Lipman briefly introduce herself, but before we do that, I wanted to share with all of our scholars and alumni today. And it looks like I can't share my screen. So Melanie, if you don't mind giving me permissions. Thank you. Thanks, Melanie. All right. So just wanted to inform everyone that this is our second and final Tax Matters hours for this fall semester. Feel free as you're coming in to briefly introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your partner college that you're attending, maybe your major, and also feel free to type in any questions to the chat as well, and I can ask those questions throughout the next hour. These questions can range from anything tax related, whether you want to know more about ITINs. What is an ITIN? What are EINs? If you have any questions related to business taxes, maybe you're wanting to start your own business or already have one created and you have questions around that. Those are ideas of types of questions you can ask if interested. I do also want to remind our scholars and alumni that if you didn't join us over the summer for our summer career series, we had 5 career-related events for our scholars. And Professor Francine actually hosted one of those events on ITINs and EINs. All of these sessions are recorded and you can find them on our YouTube channel. So we encourage you to check those out when you see fit. The last thing I'm going to mention is another career-related event that we will actually be having next week. You should have received emails about this, and it's Teach for America. They are doing an info session next week on Tuesday, November 15th, to talk about 2 paid opportunities that all of our scholars who are interested are able to attend and learn more. One of those paid opportunities is Teach for America's Ignite Fellowship Program, which is open to all of our scholars and all majors. You don't have to be an education major. And it's also open to all of our scholars, regardless of work authorization. So long as you have a valid Social Security number or a valid ITIN number, you would be eligible for the Ignite Fellowship, which is a paid opportunity. Applications are open right now. They close sometime in December, and that experience would take place in the spring. Teach for America will also be talking about their core member program, which is open to graduating seniors and does require work authorization. That is a 2-year program once you graduate from your undergrad. So if that sounds of interest, we hope to see some of you next week on Tuesday. So with that, I will have Professor Francine Lipman from UNLV's Boyd School of Law briefly introduce herself.
Great to see everyone, although I can't see you, but I can kind of see your names on the screen. I am a law professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, in the law school. So I teach federal income tax classes and accounting and business tax classes. I also serve Nevada as a tax commissioner. I was appointed by the current Governor Sisolak, and prior to that, I was appointed by Governor Sandoval. I am very engaged with the immigrant community in Nevada and candidly across the globe through organizations like TheDream.Us and a myriad of other organizations. And specifically, I've been working with unauthorized immigrants since probably before some of you were even born, back in 2005, predominantly in the tax area. So I am ready, willing, and able to answer your tax questions. I do just want to say I am not an immigration lawyer, so I really can't answer those questions, but I know you have great access to lawyers and experts in that area. One of the cool things, and I always want to encourage students like you to think about going to law school, the intersection of tax and immigration law is really fascinating. And if you do end up in law school and want to become an immigrant lawyer, immigration lawyer, you'll need to know something about tax. So this is going to be helpful for you. I also want to say that, as you know from interacting with TheDream.Us, we are one big community across the globe. We have a lot more in common than differences. And after the last session, I had a student reach out to me who happened to be in Las Vegas. And he had an issue, and I was able to connect him up with someone in Las Vegas to help him navigate and resolve his question. So don't be intimidated, be empowered. You are, we're going to be passing that baton to you pretty quickly. So we want you to be empowered and ask questions and be the best that you can be. And we want to help you do that.
Thank you, Professor Lipman, for that wonderful introduction of yourself, as well as sharing that from our last Tax Matters Q&A, you were able to assist one of our scholars post-session. So that's wonderful. Remind me at the end. I will also share Professor Lipman's email. So if any of you have additional questions, she is happy to help assist you. I will also restate what Professor Lipman just mentioned too, is don't hesitate to ask any questions related to taxes, ITINs, EINs. This is the place to ask. Feel free. I see that there's one question in the chat, and I will get to that, but feel free to enter your questions into the chat throughout this next hour.
I also want to give you a little bit of hope, because we always need hope. And that is that I have very recently been contacted by the U.S. Treasury, by some racial justice leaders at the U.S. Treasury, wanting to ask me about ITINs and what's working and what's not working. And I have a lot to talk to them about. And I mentioned to this very high level person in the US Treasury, in the Biden administration, that I was doing this office hour today. And so that there's a lot of interest in this issue. They were somewhat focused on families. And I said, college students are really interested in this issue. So if your ears were burning, I was talking about you guys, that you need ITINs and you want to be able to avail yourself of opportunities. And the ITIN is kind of the condition precedent to doing that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Speaking about ITINs, I think my first question to set the stage is, can you tell everyone what is an ITIN and what are the benefits of having an ITIN as an undocumented individual?
So an ITIN is the acronym. So that's an acronym, ITIN, and it stands for Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. And so it is a number that you use to file tax returns. since unauthorized immigrants cannot get Social Security numbers, or most unauthorized immigrants, as you may or may not know, individuals who have DACA can get a Social Security number. And so, but if you can't get a Social Security number and you have a tax filing obligation, you need a number. Since, you know, the world is all about categorizing people by numbers because names are too common, you need a number. So it is a number that you get from the federal government to file a tax return. Basically, during the last many years, Congress has been scrutinizing immigrants, as you all know, and they have caused there to be a more challenging process to get an ITIN. And as a result of that, the only way you can get an ITIN is if you have a tax filing obligation. So the good news, bad news is that if you are an active member of our community, you probably have a tax filing obligation. So if you earn any income, you need a tax filing tax number to file a tax return. And even if you aren't earning any income, but maybe you have a savings account, so you have interest income, or you have other investments, or you're a college student and you're paying out-of-pocket tuition, there's a tax credit called the American Opportunity Tax Credit that you can get a refund effectively of up to $2,500 to reimburse you for out-of-pocket higher education tuition costs. And in order to get that, you need an ITIN. So it's a filing process with the IRS. You have to submit a tax return plus a one-page form. Unfortunately, you also have to provide identification documents. Those can be as simple as a passport, or if you don't have a current valid passport, a driver's license, which has a picture ID, and then a birth certificate. So there's a bunch of forms that you can use. The most common really is the passport. And you submit that to the Internal Revenue Service, and eventually, they're very slow going, but eventually you'll get a letter back giving you a number. And then you're going to use that number for the rest of your life until you get hopefully authorized and then a Social Security number.
Thank you for sharing, Professor Lipman. And so just to recap what you said, in order to apply to an ITIN or apply for an ITIN number, you need to have a tax return or have a tax filing obligation, plus completing a one-page form, a tax form.
W-7, yeah, it's a W-7. You can Google it and see it. It's pretty straightforward.
And then some sort of identification, such as a valid passport or driver's license, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
And by the way, the ITIN, the number looks very similar to a Social Security number in that it's got the same number of digits with the same dashes. But all ITINs start with a 9. So you can immediately, if you know that, you can, if someone gives you their taxpayer identification number, you can look at it. And if it starts with a 9, that person does not qualify for a Social Security number, and it is not a Social Security number.
Very, very helpful to know. I'm seeing some questions come in, so I'll go back to our first one.
Okay.
And the question is, how can I get an EIN, not an ITIN, but an EIN while being undocumented? And on top of that, if you want to briefly explain first what an EIN is to our audience.
Sure. So an EIN is another identification number. So that is an employer identification number. So that is the tax ID number for a business. And what's interesting, they call it an employer identification number, even if the business doesn't have any employees. I've always thought that's odd, but that's just the acronym. So an EIN. Getting an EIN actually is much easier than getting an ITIN. And in fact, if you just go to the IRS's website, you can apply for an EIN, an employer identification number, online and get it quite quickly. Unfortunately, to get an EIN, an employer identification number, you have to have either an ITIN or a social security number. So if you're unauthorized, that means you can't get a social security number unless you have DACA. So you're going to need to apply for an ITIN. This becomes very frustrating for many immigrants, and this is something I'm going to talk to the U.S. Treasury about, because it's frustrating that if you want to start a business, right? Many of you are entrepreneurs, and since you can't be hired because you don't have work authorization, one way to navigate producing income is to start a business, right? And then contract with have your business contract. So in order to start your business, to have a tax filing obligation, you need an ITIN, but you can't get an ITIN until you have a tax filing obligation. So it's very frustrating because it's a chicken and the egg, which came first. I work, as I said, with many other immigrant groups, and this has just been a constant frustration. So you're going to have to get that ITIN first. The good news is, if you're a college student and you have out-of-pocket costs for tuition or required books, then you can file a tax return, even if you don't have any earned income, no income. How do students survive on no income? Well, we know loans or gifts, or they live with mom and dad, or scholarships. And so you can apply for this American Opportunity Tax Credit, and that way you can get an ITIN. And then you can start your business by applying for an EIN.
Very, very helpful and good to know. In order to apply for an EIN, you need either a social security number if you have DACA, or you need to get that ITIN if you do not have DACA.
Exactly.
So you also mentioned that with a tax filing obligation, one of those obligations could be if you're paying college out of pocket. So for our Dream.Us scholars, our scholarship does pay all tuition. With that said, some of our scholars do have to pay out of pocket for books, supplies, things like that. So your expertise with the American Opportunity Tax Credit, if our scholars are paying out of pocket expenses, they could qualify and use this as a tax obligation when applying for the ITIN. Is that correct?
Right. And so unfortunately, it has to be required books and supplies. And so that is one reason why I know as a law professor, when we file our syllabus, we have to indicate if a book is required. And so if a book is required, then it can satisfy this obligation. I know I haven't been in the sciences for a while, but some of you out there might have. I know sometimes you even need like a microscope or a lab coat or something that would be required. So, and even if that's somewhat modest, let's say books I know are expensive, a couple $100 or so, then you could file for a tax credit and get up to 25% reimbursement of that out-of-pocket amount. And that certainly would be worth it. And it would then allow you to apply for an ITIN.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that and clarifying that they need to be required
Yes.
books or
Yeah.
equipment.
Right. So unfortunately, it wouldn't cover, paper and pencils or I know some colleges were actually requiring a laptop or giving a laptop, again, to try to navigate this, but it has to be required and it cannot be housing or food, which, as we know, housing and food is required but to survive, but not required books.
Good to know. Another question that we have that has come in is, if I have an ITIN and I disclose the information to my tax preparer that I used some of the Dream.Us, we also offer or give our scholars stipends per semester. So if this student discloses the information to my tax preparer that they used some of the stipend money for personal matters, is that taxable? And then also a follow-up question, if you're familiar with the 1098T form, I can ask that follow-up question. If box 5 on my 1098T form is more than box 1, which is the tuition cost, is it an obligation to report it?
So those are great questions. So scholarships, to the extent you get a scholarship and it doesn't exceed your tuition, fees, and required books, then it's not income. Okay, so to the extent you get a scholarship that is equal to your tuition or fees, you don't have income. To the extent it exceeds that, then actually the good news is you have a tax filing obligation. And don't worry about owing an income tax, because in America, we have a tax system that understands that low-income individuals or poverty-level individuals do not have excess dollars to pay a tax liability. So if you are a college student and you receive a stipend above and beyond tuition and fees, then you are obligated to report that. But there is a standard deduction that everyone gets, and that dollar amount, if you're single, is about $13,000. And so you could get above and beyond tuition and fees up to $13,000 as a single person and still not have a tax obligation. So I hope you get more than $13,000 above your tuition and fees. And even then, it's just the amount above that amount that's subject to a tax liability. And that's a very low rate. The lowest rate is 10%. And so, if I said, here's $1,000 and you have to pay 10% of that, you'd happily take it, right? Because you get to keep 90%.
And it would also help with I
Think
was
of
going
the
to
person
mention.
who won the Powerball. Would you, yeah,
Oh,
it's taxable, but that's a good problem to have, right?
yeah. Well, and in this case too, it would help our scholars who don't have an ITIN be able
Yeah,
to file for one. So great.
exactly. Exactly. So, yeah.
So
And if you don't file, the government's really not going to come after you because of this very large standard deduction. But as Nicole said, you should file a tax return to get that ITIN. And ITINs, even though it is a tax reporting obligation, when you go to the bank to open a bank account, a checking account, they always ask for a taxpayer identification number. You will have one. When you apply for scholarships, they often ask for a taxpayer identification number. I noticed in the slides that Nicole was showing, in order to get this fellowship, you needed a taxpayer identification number. So even though it's only, the IRS, federal government says it's for tax reporting only, other businesses, other establishments use that number for identification purposes.
yes, definitely. And thank you for sharing some of those benefits on getting an ITIN, including you mentioned earlier on ways that our scholars can generate income using an ITIN, such as starting a business, applying to the Teach for America, one of their paid opportunities, doing independent contract work, etc. So those are just some of the benefits to getting an ITIN. Another question that came through is, does a checking account count for a tax file obligation? And if not, can you also give us more examples of what is a tax filing obligation?
Sure. So unfortunately, a checking account is not a tax filing obligation. And that's a good question. So again, that's a little bit of one of these chicken and the egg things, in that when you go to a bank to try to open an account, one of the first questions on all of their pro forma forms is your taxpayer identification number. And so if you don't have one, becomes very frustrating for you and for the business. Some other, I've worked again with a lot of people. If you don't have one, you might provide your driver's license number if you have that, or you could provide your passport number. They just want to be able to identify you, and not surprisingly, especially if you overdraw your account, they want to try to find you out there beyond your name. A tax filing obligation is going to be anytime you earn income. So if you have wages, if you have a salary, if you make tips, if you have a scholarship that exceeds your tuition and fees for higher education, if you have an independent contractor, so you receive money for walking dogs, babysitting. If you have a business, let's say you don't have any sort of identification number, but you've been selling on eBay. I don't know, maybe you knit hats or something. And so you sell these products, or maybe you sell used clothes on eBay. That is generating potentially income. Now, so there's a tax filing obligation there. So anytime you earn income, and even the good news is you can file a tax return even if you have a loss. So many people, especially in the startup phase, will have losses on their business, but you can file if you receive proceeds from, let's say you sell a car and you receive cash for that car. In some states, they require you to report that to the DMV, potentially pay sales tax on it. So any sort of commerce, any sort of business activity, whether it be working, providing services, selling products, you have to report that to the government. And the way you do that is through an annual tax return.
Thank you for that list of examples. And to follow up, so you had mentioned anytime you earn income. So if I walked my neighbor's dog, or I babysat, or I tutored kids at my local elementary school, and I was receiving cash in return for providing these services, that would be a tax obligation that I could use to then file my ITIN, correct?
Yes, and obviously to a certain extent, because I can think back to when I was quite young, maybe even 12 years old, I would babysit for my next door neighbor. And this was back in the day when I think I got 50 cents an hour. And I'm saying this and live, and it's being recorded. I do not recollect filing a tax return, but
is there a minimum amount you would need to file a tax return?
So there actually is not, but as we, I work with the IRS on a regular basis, and they haven't suggested that at all. But modest amounts, we can think about small amounts here or there, just doesn't amount to much. It doesn't even amount to record keeping, right? But again, to try to obtain an ITIN, to the extent you have business activity, you really should file a tax return, get that number, report it. But Nicole, what you're saying is, to the extent you're self-employed, there might be an out-of-pocket tax liability. So there might not be a federal income tax liability because the standard deduction is so high, but you might have to pay into Social Security and Medicare, which is 15.3%. And so there could be a cost to that. But again, it's important to file, make sure that your record is clear, and very likely the dollar amounts are going to be modest.
Okay. Yeah, this is all very educational and great question that was asked, and thank you for answering. Another question around the ITIN is, can an ITIN be used to get a credit card?
Another great question, and we get mixed answers on this question from the various businesses that provide credit. What is interesting, as a student, a college student, quite often credit is made a little bit more readily available to you because businesses look at you and they think you're a good risk. You're investing in yourself. You're going to college. So I can recall when I was in college, we would get lots of applications. And so different businesses will require different information. My sense is, from working with lots of individuals like yourself, is they will take an ITIN and be happy to have that number. A more interesting question I have been asked is, if you have an ITIN and you've been out and about using credit cards, etc., do the various agencies that give you a credit rating, do they use your ITIN to develop a credit rating? We know, so for example, I have been paying on credit cards for many, many years. And so I have a credit rating. And if I'm going to borrow money, buy a house, buy a car, rent a car, a lot of different engagement in business activity, they will want to check my credit. And so in order to check my credit, they need to get me to authorize that affirmatively. And then also they will want my taxpayer identification number. So I have a social security number, I give it to them, and they can pull up my credit rating very quickly. There are basically three big agencies that do it. So we've gotten mixed responses whether they do the same thing with ITINs. Some say yes, some say no. My sense is the answer is really yes. And so what we have been encouraging people to do is, if eventually you get a social security number, so when the DREAM Act first came out, DACA first came out, we were really encouraging people who were getting social security numbers who already had ITINs to take their ITIN credit record and move it to their social security number. So we had them write letters to each of those agencies to move their credit rating to their new number. So that to me certainly implies that these agencies use an ITIN. So I think the answer is yes. Obviously, some companies might push back, but I would be surprised.
Yeah, and I would agree with you too, Professor Lipman, that some banks will use an ITIN to get a credit card. We've heard from some of our scholars that they've used their ITIN to get a credit card or open up an account with Bank of America, for example.
Yes.
So it can be dependent based off of the person you're talking to and or the company that
The
you're looking at.
creditor, right? You can imagine, you know, there's a lot of different companies advancing credit, and so they each have different requirements, but I think more and more they're using ITINs, and they have been for a while.
Mm-hmm. Next question, and this is a great question because we haven't touched on this yet, about can we use our parents' tax filing to get an ITIN?
So that is a great question. And the short answer is yes. And in fact, in college, many of you are claimed as a dependent on your parents' tax return. As long as you're a full-time student and under age 25, your parents can claim you as a dependent. And by the way, even if you are effectively paying out of pocket for college or books, but if you're living with your parents, they can claim the American Opportunity Tax Credit because effectively money's fungible, right? They feed you, you're paying for a book. It's kind of the same thing, you know, money coming out of the left-hand side or the right-hand side. So if your parents claim you as a dependent, then you might already have an ITIN. So if they have filed tax returns claiming you as a dependent, my guess is you already have an ITIN. So you better ask your parents before you start applying if they have a taxpayer identification number for you. If they do, and even if they haven't been claiming you for a while, that is your number. Your number might have expired if you don't use an ITIN on a tax return for 3 consecutive years, it will expire. However, you can resurrect it by renewing it. Renewing it actually is easier than the initial application. And what you do is you just file a W-7, that same form, fill it out, and then include your identification documents. You don't need to send in a tax return to renew it, but you do need that number because you have to put that on the W-7. So make sure before you apply for an ITIN that you ask your parents if you already have one. And they might, so many people go to a paid prepare or even volunteer income tax assistance programs to get their tax returns done. And so they might not know all the details of the tax return. And because more and more everything is done electronically, they might not have even really looked at the tax forms, but they should absolutely have gotten a copy. And so what you want to do is, even if they say, well, we claimed you, but I don't know that you have a number, you want to ask them to look at those forms. And when you look at the Form 1040, you should see on the first page, dependents, and you'll see your name with a number. That is likely your ITIN number. So if your parents have been filing tax returns for years, my guess is they applied for a number for you. So I would investigate that first.
Yes, definitely. And thank you to the scholar that asked that question initially, because for those of you that are unsure or don't think you have an ITIN number, talk to your parents first and look at their tax filing records, and look at the 1040 form, as Professor Lipman mentioned, under the dependents section, and you should see your name and that 9-digit number. Right. And that's your ITIN. Yeah, and that would be your ITIN. So great question, and thank you for answering.
And let me just a quick follow-up, sorry, because this is something that's very frustrating. And I think, Nicole, we've talked about this, and I've talked about this with other students. So let's say something happened, maybe your parents don't have the forms, right? Can't find the forms, but they believe you had a number. So then the student will say to me, well, where can I find my ITIN? I don't have a good answer to that. If you don't, have the original tax returns, the good news is your parents could try to get the forms from the IRS. You can ask for copies of old returns. But let's suppose you filed and you think you might have had an ITIN and you can't find it. How do you find your old ITIN number? And there isn't a good way to look it up. There isn't some online system that you could try to access it. And unfortunately, by name, many immigrants, many people have the same name. Think about how many Jane Smiths there are out there. And so that's something that would be very helpful if people could look up somehow that number and try to find it. Yes. Again, if parents had filed tax returns, the good news is, and they don't have copies, go to the paid preparer. The paid preparer should have copies, but if they've moved, you can go online to the IRS and actually send them a letter and ask for or request back tax returns. So there is a way to do that. Not surprisingly, it's time consuming, but at least it's one way to try to navigate it.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I know we've had these conversations prior, and you're right, it is very frustrating. If you can't hunt down your parents' tax records. But hopefully that's something you can share with, as you mentioned at the beginning, with your meeting with US
Yes.
Treasury later.
Yes.
So a follow-up question to that. So let's say our scholars do reach out to their parents and they see their parents' old tax return forms, and they find one from, let's say, 2015 with their name and their ITIN number under the dependent section in the 1040 form. You had mentioned earlier that ITINs are only good for 3 years. So if I'm looking at an old tax return my parents filed from 2015, for example, would that ITIN no longer be valid?
So that ITIN is still your ITIN, but it's expired. And so what you need to do is you need to renew it. And the way you renew it is just file this W-7 and with your information and your identifying documents, and that will resurrect it. Let's suppose you find your ITIN number and you just don't know how long ago it was used, right? So you don't know if it was within the last 3 consecutive years. So what you might do is you file a tax return, just like you would if your ITIN hadn't expired. And don't worry, the IRS will send you a letter and they will say, your ITIN has expired. You need to renew it. Here's the way you renew it. And then they won't process your return. They'll hold it. And they will wait for you to renew your ITIN. Once you renew your ITIN, then they will process the return. So if you're not sure, that's one way to navigate it.
And then a follow-up question to that, and then I see there's another question I'll ask later. What if your parents never claim you on their tax return? Then they would have to go about applying for an ITIN themselves, correct?
Right. So if your parents have been filing a tax return and not claiming you for one reason or another, then they should have ITINs or Social Security numbers if they qualify. Now, if they believe that is an error for some reason, you can amend tax returns up to and potentially get a refund back up to 3 years from the due date of the filing of the tax return. So they could amend it and maybe get some money back. Or if there's some other reason they didn't claim you, that's fine. That's fine. It's a facts and circumstances analysis. And for some reason, if they didn't feel they qualified and they didn't claim you, that's fine.
Okay. Wow, I didn't know all of this information about taxes and tax forms and being able to amend past tax forms. So this is all great information for us to be learning. Another question that came through the chat is, my college reduces taxes from certain grants, fellowships, and awards that I receive, but I never gave out an ITIN. And that's a question, or question mark, or receive any form to report it. Where does this money go? And does the IRS know I'm paying these taxes?
So that is a great question. So what you're saying is that you receive fellowships or stipends from your school, and they're withholding taxes from that. So if they are withholding taxes from that, then they needed to pay that over to the federal government, and they needed to provide the federal government with a taxpayer identification number. So it is surprising to me, they didn't ask for that number from you. I don't know how they can pay it over to the Internal Revenue Service without the number. And so I would go back to the school. They might have, sometimes when we fill out forms, when we fill out applications, there could be some miscommunication. So who knows? Maybe they put that money under one of your parents' identification numbers. When you were applying, maybe you provided your parents' tax returns, right? I know for certain scholarships, you have to show your parents' income levels. So I would go back to the school and ask them, what taxpayer identification number did you use when you're paying over those tax dollars? And if they didn't have a taxpayer identification number, and if they didn't pay it over to the government agency, the IRS, the US Treasury, they owe you that money back. And so I would definitely follow up with them. They might have used a number that wasn't your taxpayer identification number. So I think you need to clarify that. But that you're right to think, how the heck, how would the IRS know what to do if they didn't have a number? And my guess is maybe it never got paid over to the federal government, and they need to give it to you. And then you can decide whether you need to file a tax return with respect to that.
So I see that we have about 8 minutes left. I did just put in the chat Professor Lipman's email address for anyone interested in emailing Professor Lipman directly. I do want to also quickly ask questions about, you briefly mentioned the VITA program, as well as, you didn't mention it, but talking about what is a CAA, and how a CAA can be beneficial for some of our scholars when applying for an ITIN.
Great. I was thinking the same thing, Nicole, that we've got to mention that. So somehow, some way, it's hard for me to believe, but the end of 2022 is fast approaching. Wow. I mean, we're almost at Thanksgiving, and then it's going to be Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever holiday you celebrate. December 31st is fast upon us. What that means is you maybe in the beginning of 2023 can file a tax return and apply for an ITIN if you don't already have one. Well, how do you go about doing that? The good news is there are helpers out there. There are a lot of helpers. Volunteer Income Tax Assistance, so another acronym, VITA, Volunteer Income Tax Assistance. These are individuals who are trained by the federal government. It is not the federal government, but it's people that are volunteering. Many of them are retired CPAs, enrolled agents, accountants, people who just want to help people and have extra time. So they're trained and they can electronically prepare tax returns for free, pro bono, on a pro bono basis for free. They're located throughout the country, and a lot of them are on college campuses. So how do you find one? Well, go to the IRS website, and they have a map for volunteer income tax assistance programs. And you put in your zip code, and then a bunch of programs within 25 miles or whatever radius you enter will come up. And there usually is pretty good information about their hours, their location, their requirements, what you should bring. So find one in your area. They will help you prepare a tax return. Now, if you don't have an ITIN, then it is a little bit more complicated because you're going to need to take that tax return and you are going to not have them file electronically because you don't have a number yet. So you're going to take that tax return, have them printed out, and then you're going to hopefully find someone who is a certifying acceptance agent. And that is this other acronym, a CAA. A certifying acceptance agent can help you not only prepare your W-7, which is the application for the ITIN, but they can also, even better than helping you prepare that one form, they can authenticate your documents. So you'll sit there, you'll give them your passport, and they will look at the passport, they'll look at you, and they'll say, okay, this is a real person, this is not fraud, I see their name, I see other identifying documents, and they will look at the passport, they'll make sure it's valid, and then they will make copies of it, and they will send in those copies for you so that you don't have to send in your passport. That is priceless because we're hearing, and then that you will mail the tax return, the W-7, the authenticating document of your passport, all up to the IRS in Austin, Texas, I think is where the current office is that processes these ITINs. Then you will get a letter from them giving you your ITIN. This is much better than you having to mail in your passport, because what we're hearing, Nicole, I got an update on this more recently, is it's taking between 9 and 11 weeks to process these ITIN applications. And by the way, that is not during busy season. So during, April, March and April, it's going to be slower. But during that time, they keep your passport if you mail it in. And I don't want any of you not to have your passport with you. So go to the IRS website. They have a list of CAAs as well. Same deal, put in your zip code. They can help you find them. But unfortunately, many CAAs will charge. And so you'll see the list, and it probably will be obvious these are for-profit companies. Some of them include H&R Block, Jackson Hewitt, kind of the typical tax filing preparers. And so make some phone calls and just ask them how much they charge. And you can explain you're a college student. Is there a college student discount, or do they know of any free resource? The IRS is getting an enormous amount of money from Congress. And I just saw they're planning to hire 700 people to man taxpayer assistance centers. That's good news, because these taxpayer assistance centers can authenticate your documents. So that's another option that should become more prevalent. Unfortunately, during COVID, a lot of these things shut down, and so resurrecting them has become more challenging. But I hope that answered your question.
Yes, that did. And the very, very important information about the VITA program, which is free, that you can utilize. And then the CAA, the Certified Acceptance Agents, which we highly recommend as part of the ITIN application. You do need to show your identification and have that authenticated, like your passport or driver's license. And one option is to mail it into the IRS, which we do not want you to do. It could get lost. It could be months until you get it back. So that's some of the reasons we don't want you to do that. But if you go through a CAA, they can visually authenticate your documents in person, make copies, and then give it back to you during that same meeting. So you will still have your important identification documents with you at all times. So thank you, Professor Lipman, for talking through that.
One other thing I would suggest, so students, tell your parents about the volunteer income tax assistance program. We really want more people to utilize these programs. It's free. People are trained. They know what they're doing. They're going to do the returns correctly. They electronically file it and prepare it for free. And you can use VITA services if your income is below something like $65,000 or $70,000. So the threshold is quite high. So it might make sense for you to go with your parents if you're still in the same community, and then the tax preparer can evaluate whether you should be claimed as a dependent on their tax return too. So it could be a win-win situation. And we know you want to spend more time with your parents too.
So I do have one last question. It was privately messaged to me. It's a little long, so I'm also going to put it in the chat, Professor Lipman, if you need to reference it. Does a dependent with an ITIN apply to child tax credit? If not, what are the benefits for a dependent with an ITIN to be claimed on my parents' tax return? If there is no benefits, is it required to file with my parents and apply for an ITIN?
Great question. So most of you will not qualify your parents for the child tax credit because you have to be under age 18. And actually, that was for 2021. So now that we're just about into 2022, it's under age 17. So unless you're a child prodigy, you've probably aged out of the child tax credit for your parents. Good question. Being a dependent on a tax return may qualify if you have a single parent. So let's say your parents are divorced, you live with your mom, you being on her tax return will qualify her for head of household filing status. So that could be very beneficial. Another option, if you are in college and you are paying out of pocket some higher ed tuition, then if your parents file for the American Opportunity Tax Credit, they might get a larger dollar amount than you would if you don't have any income. So there are some potential benefits, but as you said, you don't qualify your parents for the child tax credit. How do you analyze it? Well, it's a facts and circumstances analysis. And the question is, whoopsie. Sorry about that. I got a spam call in the middle of it. So the question is, it's a facts and circumstances analysis. And it's basically, are you a dependent? Do they provide over half of your support? Are you living in their household for more than half the year? And so if you are not living at home and they're not supporting you at all, then you are likely not a dependent to be claimed by your parents. But if they're supporting you by paying your insurance, providing you with food and shelter, then you likely are dependent.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Lipman, for answering that final question and your time spent with us today. I am putting Professor Lipman's email in the chat once again. For those of you that have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to email Professor Lipman. I will also mention that this session is being recorded. The last Tax Matters Q&A session was recorded as well and will be put up on YouTube. Also, the Summer Career Series session focused on ITINs and EINs is already on YouTube, so you can check out our YouTube page for that. And everyone on the webinar today, thank you so much for your time. Wonderful questions. Hopefully you have a better understanding of ITINs, EINs, some of your tax related questions. And then if you do have any questions in terms of how to find the YouTube video or any further information, you can also reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat. And everyone enjoy the rest of your week and have a good upcoming weekend. Thanks all.